Australia is a country. It's made up of states and territories, and they have borders, which are mostly straight lines. But not Victoria and New South Wales. They share a squiggly border. So why is the Victorian border so squiggly? I know one way to find out. I'm catching a train to Echuca, which is on the border of Victoria and New South Wales, to find out why it's so squiggly. But whilst I travel, let's learn a bit about how the state of Victoria came to be. It all begins in November of 1834 when Edward Hentley first established a permanent European colony at Portland Bay. But wait, that's not where it starts. It would be inappropriate to talk about Australia's colonial history without mentioning the people who were already living here. Indigenous Australians have been living in Australia for 60,000 years. There are hundreds of different Indigenous nations, or they were before colonisation. And instead of looking like this, Australia would have looked more like this. Unfortunately though, European colonisers didn't recognise the Indigenous people as, well, people, and more often than not drove them off their lands that they'd lived on for millennia, often with extreme violence. And this is a huge tragedy. As well as people being treated really unfairly, there was a huge loss of culture, a loss of language, and this is a big problem. What happened to Indigenous Australians at the hands of colonisers meets a lot of the characteristics of genocide. I've left an essay in the linked documents if you want to do some further reading. I want to mention this because I'm going to talk about the history of different colonies in Australia, and I'd not be doing my job if I didn't acknowledge that this was not a good time for the Indigenous Australians, and all this was happening as the stories that we're going to be telling today happened. The European map of Australia in the early 1800s looked very different to what it does now. Most of the landmass of Australia was the colony of New South Wales, but the colony of Western Australia and South Australia had been established. In Port Phillip Bay, there was a brief convict settlement on the peninsula from 1803 to 1804, but there wasn't really much permanent European activity in what is now Victoria in the early 19th century. Edward Hentley established a European settlement at Portland Bay in 1834. Then in 1835, a group of settlers came up from Tasmania and made a settlement in Port Phillip. John Batman was one of those in charge, and in June of 1835 signed 2 treaties with local Indigenous groups to purchase land in and around what is now Melbourne. See my video on why Melbourne was almost called Batmania for more nuance. Sir Richard Burke, who was the Governor of New South Wales at the time, said that the treaty was not legitimate and that folks setting up settlement were trespassing on Crown land. He later granted squatters' rights for £10 each, which helped the population of the Port Phillip area grow. By 1840, there were at least 10,000 Europeans living in the Port Phillip area. A separation association formed because they weren't happy with how little representation they had in their colony. They wanted to become their own colony with their own government and not be ruled by a government which was a week's horse ride away or 2 weeks via ship. There was an early petition to separate which was denied. Eventually they were granted 6 of the 24 members of the New South Wales Legislative Council, but it was expensive for these 6 to live in Sydney, and it was a long way from Melbourne, and because there were only 6, they were often outvoted by the northern members. Years of campaigning continued. Eventually it made its way to the British Parliament, who eventually passed the Australian Constitution Act of 1850, which gave permission for a new colony to be. They named it Victoria after the Queen. Once the new Legislative Council was established, the colony of Victoria came to exist on the 1st of July, 1851. But why is the border so squiggly?
It's a river. It's the Murray River. That's what the squiggly bit is. It's a river. All right, well, I've got to catch a train home now. I'll find some lunch first, actually, before I take another 3-hour trip on the train.
It was decided that Victoria's border would be from the source of the Murray River through to the border of South Australia. It's squiggly because it's a river, and rivers squiggle. Victoria's border with New South Wales is one of the few land borders in Australia that follow a natural feature. You'll notice that most of them are straight lines that follow arbitrary lines of longitude or latitude. But wait, Victoria has a straight bit too. This diagonal line on the eastern side of the state. What's going on there? Well, a river can't run from coast to coast. That's not how rivers work. So they put a straight line drawn from the source of the Murray to Cape Howe. Well, as straight as a line on a globe can be. This is the Black Allen Line, named after the surveyors who mapped it, who were both named Alexander. Alexander Black and Alexander Allen. And that's the New South Wales Victorian border. But wait, if we know anything about rivers, it's that they meander, and they're constantly in a process of eroding and depositing sediment in different places which become land. What does this mean for the border of Victoria and New South Wales going forward? Over hundreds of years, the river will look quite different. If the border doesn't move to match the river, there will be parts of Victoria on the right-hand side of the river and parts of New South Wales on the left-hand side of the river. Well, as of recent years, governments acknowledge that rivers change, and so have been updating the border. Since 2012, the border has regularly been checked with various different satellite technologies and periodically refreshed to reflect the course of the river. The left bank of the river continues to be Victoria, whereas the water and the right-hand side of the river continues to be New South Wales, adjusting for when the river changes.
Well, that was probably a bigger day than was needed for the kind of question that we're asking today, but it was great to do. I enjoyed going on a bit of a train journey to the border of Victoria and New South Wales to show you why the border is so squiggly. I know some of you watching have never seen Victoria as a state, so there's some Australian history for you. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey and for this video today. If you would like to see more of my videos, please consider subscribing to That's Pretty Cool, and I'd love to know what you thought about this video in the comments below and the like button. I make videos that inspire in me, or they're about topics and questions that inspire in me a sense of curiosity and wonder, and I'd love to have you along for the journey. So thank you for joining me today. Take care, stay curious, and I will see you next time.